a senior researcher at the ETI, and I am extremely honored to chair this panel today with extremely highly esteemed speaker lineup and on a very, very relevant topic. So I will chair, the panel is on the EU socio-economic governance for equal society in times of crisis. And we already saw sort of introduction of inequalities and the attempts to reach equality. In general, tackling inequalities are always among the sort of a political aims, both at national, EU level, also among the aims of unions and other stakeholders in the game. And obviously, it is a good idea to tackle inequality. And our plan in this panel is to look how much EU economic governance, how much coordination of EU economic policies actually manages to do that. Sort of how much can we manage in these sort of EU political circles, I guess, to put our money where our mouth is. So sort of promising tackling inequality and then actually doing that. And we have an extremely great, I mean, like I said, very honored to chair and introduce our really highly esteemed speakers. We will sort of go for, when it comes to topics, we will go from more bird's eye perspective, and then we will zoom in. So we will start with Vivian Schmidt. She's Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration in Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, Honorary Professor at Louis University in Rome. She has won so many awards and has so many great achievements that it would take me really, I think, 5 minutes to really introduce herself. So she's basically a name which doesn't need to be introduced as much, because I think everyone in this room probably knows her already. And she will today speak about the Eurozone crisis and the problematic issues emerging from that, especially concerning the EU's accountability and democratic legitimacy. And she will also sort of look into what has been different when it comes to tackling the COVID crisis, and where do we go from there, and how could we improve EU socio-economic governance and when it comes to tackling such big shocks. Then as a second speaker, we have Joe Darvash, Senior Fellow at the Bruegel and Senior Research Fellow at Corvinus University of Budapest. He has held visiting research positions at the Bank of Finland, Deutsche Bundesbank, the Niederländische Bank, Stockholm School of Economics, and so on and so on. He has already also advised worked on research projects for the European Commission, Parliament, and OECD, etc., etc. And he will look at the EU socio-economic governance from an economic perspective, and he will sort of show us and explain to us a little bit, has economic coordination of economic policies really tackled anything when it comes to inequalities, and especially regional inequalities in Europe? And we have asked him to sort of look into a little bit also the geographical regional inequalities in Europe in this from this perspective. Last but definitely not least, we actually have scored somebody from the European Commission to talk to us. Today, Suzanne Conze is head of unit for country analysis in the DG for Education, Culture, Youth and Sport at the European Commission. And I mean, she also holds a PhD, so she comes from an academic background as well, which obviously in this lineup, I think fits in extremely great. And she will zoom in on one of the case studies in economic coordination, namely education. Which is probably the key area if we want to tackle inequality in any sort of a fundamental way. We have to deal with education, we have to deal with access to education and inequalities related to education in Europe. So, and then finally, my very dear colleague, Sylvia Rainona, who is my fellow researcher at the ETUI, specializing in labor law and affiliated member at KU Leuven, and one of her key research interests lies in EU socio-economic governance from a legal perspective. She will shortly comment on our speakers' presentations, and then we will open the floor for a longer discussion. So in terms of practicalities, each speaker will have approximately 12 minutes. So we will try to be quite strict in order for us to have time for discussion. And yes, without further ado, I will give the floor to Vivian, who is joining us online from over the ocean, I think. So welcome, Vivian, and the floor is yours.
So thanks. I'm delighted to be there. And in fact, I'm not in the US right now. I'm on the Italian coast, so not nearly as far away. So what I'd like to do in my short comments is talk about how to move beyond the mistakes of the EU, the EU's Eurozone crisis governance to learn the lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic and moving on from there. So the COVID-19 responses represented, to my mind, a great leap forward. They were a tacit acknowledgement that the Eurozone responses were not fit for purpose. I guess the question today is, will the EU go back to the status quo ante? Or will it move beyond the Eurozone and COVID-19 crises, in particular in light of the Ukraine crisis, energy, and the rest? Will it move beyond these crises effectively and democratically toward more sustainable and equitable growth and prosperity for all Europeans, while tackling inequality and precarity? So just to go back very briefly, the Eurozone crisis management itself was also a crisis of legitimacy. If we look at 2010 to 2012, crisis management was characterized by governing by rules and ruling by numbers in the Eurozone, as in the subtitle of my recent book. And it was dominated by certain economic philosophies. Basically ordo-liberalism focused on stability, deficit, and debt, regardless of rising unemployment, inequality, and poverty. In addition to the ordo-liberalism came Neo-Liberalism, which focused on structural reforms. And in the first years, in 2010, 2012, those were interpreted as crush the unions, cut the welfare state. The result from these kinds of policies is they ended up having weak economic performance, especially bad for Southern Europe, and increasingly toxic politics everywhere. We get a shift as the crisis slows in 2012 to 2015. Things get a bit better. We see the reinterpretation of the rules and the recalibration of the numbers, but by stealth, essentially without admitting it. So at the same time that you continued with the discourse of harsh austerity and structural reform, actually we saw increasing flexibility. The ECB, after Draghi's will do whatever it takes to save the euro, essentially hides in plain view that it's reinterpreting its mandate with QE, quantitative easing in particular, a big shift, in particular if we compare it to Trichet's interpretation earlier. In the council, you see a shift in the discourse from this is all about stability 2010 to 2012 to adding growth by 2012. Flexibility comes into the discourse in 2014, and then investment in 2015 with the shift to the Juncker Commission. The Commission itself between 2012 and 2015 becomes more flexible in the application of the rules, including derogation of the rules for Italy and Spain, for Italy and France, recalculating the numbers for Spain, etc. So as a result of all of this, by 2015, growth returns, and this is also when the Commission admits that, yes, it's being flexible and it has every right to be, but the damage has been done. And you can see this in the politics, in the EU's declining political legitimacy, and citizens' loss of trust in the EU Eurobarometer polls on the decline in the EU's positive image. We see growing political volatility at the national level, increasing government turnover, in particular the collapse of mainstream parties and the rise of populism. But it's evident not only in the politics, but also in the economics, in particular because although things get better, the suboptimal rules remain. And the result is You see it in the lack of investment. Those without the fiscal space could not invest, read Southern Europe, and those with the fiscal space did not invest, and that's Northern Europe. Fast forward to COVID-19 and the beginning of the crisis, and actually it looked like the Eurozone déjà vu all over again. The member states pursue their own policies. The council seems unaccountable. It fails to act. As the frugals are against grants, Germany demurs, Italy is desperate and disillusioned. And as the ECB at a very initial moment claims it's not its mandate to deal with the spreads between German and Italian bonds, although it remedies that pretty quickly. And of course, the Commission is nowhere. It has little governing authority, no mandate really in terms of health. It has constraining economic rules, limited fiscal capacity, although it still acts somewhat. It accommodates member state action. It suspends the Stability and Growth Pact and suspends state aid rules. But it too could do very little. And of course, the European Parliament had no role. These are basically in the initial 4 to 6 months, but things do change, and they changed actually rather quickly and very much for the better. In terms of COVID-19 economics, we see a great leap forward in economic integration, or call it fiscal federalism, or maybe we shouldn't use that term. But in any case, we find EU level debt for the first time is to be paid for by the EU zone resources. This is taboo breaking. And the focus is on the green transition, the digital transformation and inequality. Next generation EU plus the Resilience and Recovery Fund is a major change, although not yet arguably a Hamiltonian moment. And importantly, these resources are mainly allocated to countries damaged by the Eurozone crisis responses. They address the pre-existing economic and political conditions likely to make countries more vulnerable to post-COVID austerity adjustments and Eurosceptic forces. So it's intended to do that, plus intended to keep a level playing field and avoid growing divergencies. In particular, in those early months, it's Germany that was providing more than half the state aid. Ultimately, may not have, but I mean, importantly, this was a major change. But still, we should not forget the pandemic effects, rising poverty, gender-related inequalities become increasingly problematic, youth unemployment, especially for the NEETs, and a growing digital divide. So that's the economics. In terms of COVID politics, political legitimacy improves. We see for the first time increasing trust, a jump in trust in the EU, and national governments rise, and maybe populism is held at bay to some extent. The vast majority of Europeans seem to have accepted the emergency measures to keep people safe, even though there were mask and anti-vax protests. And in some places, illiberal governments, Poland and Hungary in particular, exploited the emergency. And finally, in terms of COVID-19 governance, I'm going to call this what we saw as positive politicization. There were better interinstitutional relations that were more responsive to citizens' desires and needs. You saw improved relations within the council with the Franco-German initiative once Germany joined the so-called Consolidated coalition. And here we should not underestimate the important role that France played. There are also new cooperative relations between the council and the commission. And as the council, after approving the Franco-German initiative, handed it over to the commission to come up with major changes. And it did that not only by proposing the Resilience and Recovery Fund, but also major changes in the European semester, which became much more bottom up from the national capitals. Where's the European Parliament in this? Actually, it had little role until the budget talks, at which point it was really important in terms of putting money back in for EU for health and pushing the rule of law. This said, there was still some negative politicization. The frugal coalition reflected the Eurozone splits, and the German Constitutional Court also, with one of its decisions, tried to put the brakes on the ECB. But all in all, COVID-19 was what one might call a good crisis. But the big questions are, where do we go from here? There's still much to be done, especially now with the next crisis, that in which we're in the Ukraine crisis, which is also an energy crisis, not only a security crisis, but also an energy crisis, a cost of living, and inflation crisis. Not to mention the climate change crisis that is ongoing. So what next? Where do we go from here? So how do we reform Eurozone management even more? Well, first, more fiscal solidarity. Why not move from a temporary fund to a permanent EU fund for solidarity? This is certainly about the green transition, the digital transformation, and addressing social inequality, but with made for purpose funds to address not just these questions, but actually also what one needs the money for is to address the increasing problems during COVID in terms of unemployment, in terms of ongoing issues regarding refugees, migration, poverty. And of course, that's part of the Ukraine crisis as well, security and energy. So there needs to be many made for purpose funds to address this as part of permanent funds. But beyond this, what about better economic governance in the Eurozone or in the EU more generally? My preference would be to jettison the Stability and Growth Pact rules entirely, but I know that that's probably pie in the sky. At least moderate them using the rules and numbers as kinds of guidelines. Importantly, the EU semester has already changed from what looked like a top-down hierarchical relationship to being more bottom-up. But it's still highly centralizing between Brussels and national capitals. There needs to be more decentralization and democratization. The question, of course, is how. One possible way beyond this, in terms of the big goals, would be have sort of grand macroeconomic policy dialogues or grand industrial policy or industrial strategy dialogues, perhaps building on the Conference for the Future of Europe, or alternatively, involving the European Parliament in a more robust way. And of course, this speaks to the need for more avenues for citizen input, more European Parliament involved in co-decision, more oversight, as in the case of the Resilience and Recovery Fund, and better linkages with national parliaments. And I guess to conclude, the question is, will any of this happen? Remember that governing by rules and ruling by numbers are only suspended. Watch out for the fiscal hawks, the frugals, talking about debt and deficits. Note that they've already started in response to inflation fears. Basically, one needs to see spending not as more debt, even with fears of inflation, but as investment for growth. EU economic governance beyond this still lacks the necessary instruments. It not only needs a permanent EU level bond capability, the ECB needs to become more proactive. A real lender of last resort needs to do more to focus on its secondary mandate, to deal with issues of employment, greening the economy, poverty. And of course, the EU itself is not sufficiently democratically legitimate. The European Parliament needs more power, especially now. After all, no taxation without representation. And this is a form of taxation now, especially if one goes for a permanent fund. Council unanimity remains a serious problem. One needs to end the ability of one member state or more to veto. And of course, more citizen involvement is necessary. Remember, the populist revolt is not over, and there continue to be major challenges to rule of law, especially Hungary and Poland. But all this said, the COVID response reverses some of the worst of the Eurozone legitimacy lapses, and at least we've made a good start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian. Thank you so much for this extremely insightful picture of the very complex interplays which happen at the European level now. So this sort of a forth-looking approach. My question always is whether these, I think EU economic governance is very much born out of different crises repeatedly. And we sometimes lack the sort of a more long-term perspective, I guess, how to develop that, because we are already dealing with other crises, the latest being Russia's war in Ukraine, but also that doesn't, cancel out others, the rule of law, etc. So now let's, without further ado, let's move forward to João Darvas, who will explain us a little bit the economics of these shocks and their impact on equality. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Zana, for first of all for inviting me, and also thank you, Vivian, for this very nice introductory presentation, which I very much enjoyed. So, not just the EU had a good start with the COVID, but I think also this session had a very good start with your presentation. I prepared a few tables and charts. So if you could show those, then I would discuss them. But until that, let me already start.
Could you please show slides? Yeah, thank you.
So I hope you can hear me now. So I was also asked to discuss some differences within the European Union and highlight the different challenges that different parts of the EU faces. So I will show a few tables and a few charts on those. Now, certainly it's not possible to go into great detail, but let me just start by showing a table which reports inequality and poverty numbers for the European Union countries in comparison with other parts of the world. And what is, well, I can also do it without slides anyway. So what I think is already well known, but I think it's worth to recall that the social problems are very much different across the EU. In particular, if you look at Southern Europe, countries there have a higher inequality than elsewhere in the EU. Also, poverty is higher in Southern Europe and in Eastern Europe than in Western European countries. So indeed, the social problems indeed differ markedly across countries. And if you look at what COVID has caused, and this is a chart which shows employment development. So this is for the European Union as a whole, and it shows according to educational attainment level. So the line with the symbols shows the total for the EU, and you can see that employment has practically returned to its pre-crisis level by the end of the previous year. But if you look at according to educational categories, we do see that people with tertiary education, they in fact didn't really suffer from job losses. There were a very minor decline in the second quarter of 2020, but instead there was a steady increase throughout the period. But people with the lowest level of education, less than primary or lower secondary, those people unfortunately suffered quite significantly, and also it remained relatively persistent. As you can see, there was a significant drop in the second quarter of 2020 when COVID hit Europe. A slight decline after that, a slight recovery since then, but overall employment levels have not returned. Now, one might argue that there's a salient trend which was going on for decades now, that more and more people have tertiary education and their jobs are going up, and fewer and fewer people have low level of education, so jobs for those people are going down. But still, even if you control for the long run trends, it is unfortunately still there that people with lower level of education suffered much more significantly during the COVID-19 crisis. And we also know, a lot of research, I also did research showing that also education very much correlates with income and also with wealth. So it's typically the poorer segments of the society which suffered more. Now, on the next slide, I broke down this chart into the three main regions of the EU: Central Eastern Europe, which is in red line, Southern Europe is in blue, and Northern Europe is in orange. And again, not surprisingly, unfortunately, we do see on the left panel, you can see the total, suggesting that Southern EU countries again suffered the most. I mean, it's also a bit of unluck due to the structure of their economy, because they are much more dependent on tourism, and certainly tourism was one of the sectors which was most hit by the crisis. And quite interesting, the Central Eastern European countries were hit, at least in the initial phase, relatively little, and also recovered relatively quickly. So if you look at the left chart, it shows that in Central Europe and in South and in Western Europe, employment levels already exceeded the pre-COVID values, which is great. In Southern Europe, it's at last going up, but still not yet reached. And again, what is the next three charts, next three panels on this chart again breaks this down into different educational level. Again, let me just focus on the right hand on the people with the lowest level of education. And we do see that there, again, Northern Western countries suffered the least and recovered the most. They have already reached the pre-crisis level. But again, in Southern Europe, but also in Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, unfortunately, again, the jobs for the poorest people have not yet recovered, and the recovery is very, very weak. And unfortunately, this suggests that the crisis widens inequalities further, and in particular hits those Southern European countries where inequality was already relatively high before the COVID crisis. So this is a very unfortunate developments. Now, what the EU can do? The EU can do a lot of things. And in particular, I think a great value that the European institutions can do is indeed legislation, because they can. I mean, also lots of legislation have been done in the past years. I mean, starting from legislation on work-life balance, on protecting workers from harmful chemicals, improving working conditions in different segments of the economy. More coordination of social security system across the EU. So I think a lot of labor standards can be improved. I think this is very, very great. What the EU also does is it makes recommendations to member states in the framework of the European semester. And here on this slide, I drew on a work two of my colleagues, which looked at those recommendations, which were the more social really related recommendations, so poverty reduction and social inclusion. Now, first of all, you can see in the first data column that about 10% of the recommendations to member states were related to these social issues. And on the second column, you can see the implementation, which is relatively limited, and in fact, even lower than the overall recommendation for considering all kinds of advices. So it seems that the EU, again, I mean, trying to improve what member states are doing, EU institutions and the Commission, and Susanna will probably talk about, at least on the educational aspect of these recommendations, but it doesn't resonate that much among member states. Now, Vivian mentioned that there was a change in the European semester, and now from the previous top-down, there is much more focus on a bottom-up approach. So we needs to see whether this will result in a change and a greater ownership of recommendations and resulting in a higher implementation. But at least in the past, what the Commission recommended and the Council approved, member states were not very keen on taking on board. Another aspect is certainly of how much we spend on social protection. And this chart just shows the latest available data on social protection expenditure in the EU. And I listed all kinds of subcomponents. I just showed the total. And I would like to make 2 points regarding this chart. The first one is that there's a huge diversity between member states. If you look at, let's say, France, Netherlands, and Germany, they are spending about 1/3 of their GDP on social protection. On the other hand, we have Ireland, Malta, and several Central European countries which spend just 15% or around that value. So there's a great diversity of what member states are doing. Whether it's due to social, political preferences, it's hard to know, but I think it's absolutely notable that some countries spend twice as much as a share of their GDP on social protection than others. But the other point is that still, if you look at the magnitude, which ranges between, let's say, 15 and 35%, is a relatively large value. So yes, some money is coming from the EU, but what's coming from the EU is relatively small compared to what member states say, but what member states actually spend. So I think that should be a strong focus on member states implementing good social protection policies. And I will end my slides with this one, which shows a measure of the efficiency of social spending. So let me just explain very briefly what you can see here. On the horizontal axis, you can see how much countries spend on social expenditure as a share of GDP. And on the vertical axis, you can see a reduction in inequality because there is a so-called market measure or market-based inequality, which shows what inequality would be without taxation and redistribution. But of course, there's a lot of taxation, a lot of redistribution. So inequality is reduced by these redistributive policies. And on the left, on the vertical axis, you can see the reduction in market income inequality. So how much redistribution reduces, and you would expect that countries spending more on social protection could achieve higher reductions in inequality than countries spending less. So I also put a regression line which is upward sloping, which is at least what I would have expected. But what is very important is that there are many countries below the line, also some above the line, but I would like to focus on the countries which are below the line. And you can see these are, again, unfortunately, Southern European countries. So Spain, Greece, Italy, and Portugal in one group. We also have Bulgaria, Romania quite below the line. Also Estonia is a little bit below the line. But the main point is, again, we're coming back to the same problem, that Southern European countries not just have major social problems, and that these social problems were even aggravated during the COVID crisis, but also their social redistribution system is much less efficient than, let's say, in Northern Europe. So even as the text says on the slide, even without extra money, Southern European countries could achieve a more equal society if they would be able to use the available money more efficiently. But apparently this is not the case. And I think this also should be a major role of EU policies to help member states better spending their available resources. I think I'm over my 12 minutes. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. I found this fascinating, as always, first finding my own member state always in the lower, it's Latvia, so it's always in the sort of worst part of any graph when it comes to social spending. But not only that, it's also this sort of idea of, okay, so we have these, attempts to coordinate, but at the same time, a lot depends on the political will. And a lot depends also on the ability, I guess, to learn from others and sort of implement reforms which fit the specific country. So and that's something I think to So this presentation was very good continuation to what Vivian said. And now we will zoom in and we will give the European Commission the word to Suzanne. And before that, I just wanted to say, please use those people who are listening in online. I see that we have quite decent online presence. Please do not hesitate to leave questions in the Q&A section or the chat. And yes, and now the floor goes to Suzanne.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's the mic on?
I think they will switch it. So they switch it
Now
automatically. Is it okay?
I think it's okay. Just
Yeah, I think it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is very close. I hope not to bite into it. No, thank you very much for inviting me, because I think it's a super interesting debate. But I have already to reduce a little bit your expectations on my part of it, because I will talk about a very limited chapter in this whole debate, and that is the role of education and social inequity. So, and I will deviate a little bit from the manuscript I had prepared for, just also to take into account the previous presentations, which I think fit fantastically into the whole discussion. And I'm very happy to have the chance to listen to them. Well, the first thing is, and clearly inequity in education. And I think having seen the graphs on the role of education level and employment rates or risk of unemployment, I think it's pretty clear what we are talking about. And getting a higher level of education is strongly linked to social upward mobility, to the possibility to make ends meet. And there is also the point where we have to look at. So what is the situation at the moment now in Europe with equity in education? And I wanted to take two examples, and that is, on the one hand, the basic skills 15 years old managed to achieve. And there we refer to PISA tests, and also later on the early school leaving. And if we look at PISA data, and the latest data is from 2018, we see a quite clear divide and performance gap between learners from low socioeconomic backgrounds and learners from high socioeconomic background. And that is quite striking. Low performance gap means here that we are measuring the number of young people in PISA tests who are not able to reach level 2 in the PISA test scale. And that means that they are not able to solve relatively simple tasks in reading and mathematics and in science. And in the performance gap between low socioeconomic background and high socioeconomic background differs across countries. So there's also, and I'm sorry, I haven't prepared it according to regional situation, but just as a remark. But at the EU average, it's 19.3 percentage points. So they perform basically 20% lower, percentage points lower than their comrades in higher education, with higher education background. And if we translate it in another way, we could say that someone from a low socioeconomic background has a chance of is 5.6% times more likely to underachieve in PISA than someone coming from a higher socioeconomic background. If we look at the situation in early school leaving, the pattern repeats a little bit, and not only a little bit, but quite strikingly. So young people from low socioeconomic background are more likely to leave education before having achieved upper secondary education. For us at European level, we always look at the group of the 18 to 24 years old having upper secondary education and not anymore in education and training, and those without are regarded as leaving early from education and training. And overall, at the moment, it's roughly 10% in Europe of young people who between 18 and 24 do not have upper secondary education level and are not anymore in education and training. Whereas among, for example, young people with migrant background, this rate is simply double, it is 22%. And so in all education performance criteria, everything we apply across our analysis, we can see that there are performance differences at the lines of socioeconomic background, gender, migration or minority background, and also regional divides. And low socioeconomic background is the largest single explanatory factor for less chances in education and lower performance in education. And in this way, also lack of opportunity and equality. So this is all not new. We have these situations since years. We have some indicators have improved, some others not. Overall, the pattern hasn't really changed over the last years and last decades. And we also have to say that changing or making education more equitable is a hard job to do. So that we should not have any doubts. It is not just by allowing people to go to school that it gets better. So we have to get a much broader view on education systems, on the structure of systems, and really take a learner's perspective where a system fails them and where a system doesn't support them necessarily or builds barriers to their success. So this is a hard job to do, and it's a hard job also for all member states doing that and trying that. I will now look also as previous speakers at the impact on COVID on this whole situation. And the COVID crisis has made inequity in education more visible and also is a huge risk factor on deepening inequity in education. So children from disadvantaged backgrounds were much more hard hit by the COVID crisis. And we all know the reports probably from media. They had less access to digital learning because simply in their households, there were not the necessary tools. They had less support at home because their parents were not able to provide them with the support either due to working situations or family situations or to own low education background. Their well-being was much more reduced than for children of more higher educated socio-economic background, up to the level that they often suffered from the fact that free school meals were lacking. Member states took measures during the COVID crisis and also afterwards to compensate for this situation. And what we can see now, little by little, is that many of these measures also helped and changed a little bit the initially very bleak picture on the impacts of the COVID crisis. So member states organized summer schools, they organized non-curricular activities, distribution of IT equipment, especially to disadvantaged learners, extra tuition for pupils lagging behind. All this is taking place and this has really helped the situation in many cases. Nevertheless, the overall picture remains that we have to look more intensively at the disadvantaged pupils because they have suffered most during this crisis. In the recovery from the crisis, and that was already mentioned, and the point where the EU is doing now better than 10 years ago is the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And this is the flagship initiative to help member states to compensate the impacts of the crisis. And in this facility, and with this facility, we see now that investing in education plays a really important role there. So we have data analyzed from 23 national recovery and resilience plans. So I have to say all member states invest in education and training from this funding. And on the basis of these 23 plans, we have analyzed already in more detail. The investments in education and skills is above 60 billion euros over the next 4 or 5 years, and that makes approximately 13% of the overall budget. This is actually, I have to say, this is more than we had expected and hoped for, and in that way we are quite happy about the amount. But it's also important to look at what member states are doing with that money. And the first thing to say is that this money will definitely boost digital transformation of education. So 30% of these 60 billion roughly will go into digital education, and especially investing in connectivity of schools, in equipment of schools, but also especially looking at the digital infrastructure and connectivity of disadvantaged schools and the situation of disadvantaged learners. It will go into other measures to modernize education systems, also mitigate the effects of the COVID crisis. So as I said, summer schools and so on, they are also partly financed with that. They will invest in universities to make them more able to become actors of change. So also be more labor market relevant in what they're in their educational offer. And also measures in several member states foresee actions to make access to tertiary education much more inclusive and equitable. The same goes also for investing in educational infrastructure, especially in rural areas to improve school networks, and in many countries where we have a problem, and especially in the rural areas to solve that. In addition, we will also, and that is still under negotiation, the structural fund, the policy cohesion funds, which of course, like in previous funding rounds, will also invest strongly in education and training. But this is on the one hand the funding side. What I think is and probably interesting also for our debate later on is the question: how is the policy process, the semester, linked to this funding? And I hope I have still enough time. I fear I'm getting over. Looking at the European semester process. This year, education has been a strong topic throughout the process compared to previous years. And I think one reason, and it really started also with the annual Sustainable Growth Survey last November, which made a clear link between education and recovery and the need to invest in education and training to master recovery. And it is also, I think, due to the background of the COVID crisis, which really showcased massively what the impact is if an education system fails and if education systems are struggling. So I think that became very obvious. So the crucial role of education for recovery is, I think, on that level clearly recognized. In the context, and now we're coming to these nice country-specific recommendations. In the context of the semester, 8 countries received a recommendation on education. We had this year a very limited set of country-specific recommendations, so 8 received one, and equity in education was a key topic among this recommendation. So to invest more in the equity of systems, to look especially at the situation of migrant pupils and the like. We also see that especially, this was already. But what I have to say, and this it's a little bit explains also the question of the low implementation of recommendations. The EU has no legal competence in education and training. So the member states have the sole responsibility for the structure of the education systems and also for the content of their education systems. We can give recommendations and cooperate with member states and try our best, but in the end of the day, it is the member state who decides. And their education reforms, and that is the second part, even if following and even if trying to implement, the impact of a reform is only late visible. So it is something a little bit more long-term investment in education, and that makes it sometimes also difficult to see an easy and immediate impact or an immediate implementation. Having said this, and the fact that the EU level has no competence in that term, what we have seen over the last decade is an increasing interest of member states to exchange on aspects of education, exchange on experience, exchange on best practices, and comparing also performances. And one term which has was created a couple of years ago and is really the let's say the direction we try to go to is the European education area. So an area which provides quality education to everybody independently from social background and without borders. And this concept and this idea requires a lot of cooperation, transparency, and trust among member states to work into this direction and to have more mutual recognition of education and really make this happen. And member states also have agreed on, and also in previous years already, on common European targets, what they want to achieve in their cooperation and in their ambitions. And this is exactly reducing early school leaving, increasing participation in early childhood education and care, important for equity, increasing tertiary education, improving basic skills of young people, digital skills, improving vocational education and training. Equity in all these debates is a key dimension. And in this cooperation framework, there's a multitude of different working groups, working contexts where member states then go really very much in detail to look at the different approaches in member states and see what they can learn from it, benefit from it. Nevertheless, and I have been worked in this context for more of a decade, I would say. I think one of the main impacts of this work so far, in my view, was that it has created a common language among member states on what we are talking about equity in education, about early school living, and what type of measures are needed. And this exchange is extremely valuable. And when we look then now back at the Recovery and Resilience Foundation facility, at the European semester, we find this language back. So there's also a formal link between the recovery and resilience plans of member states, which have to respond to country-specific recommendations from the past, from 19 and 20. There is a link between the results of this work and what the semester says. So in a way, what we have, I think, created, and that is, I can say, for education, limited experience in other fields of socio-economic policies, that this common discourse is shifting in that direction. And then, of course, in the end of the day, it is member states who need to decide. But I think I will stop here, and I'm looking very much forward to your questions. Thank you.
Suzanne, indeed, I think it's I mean, I took one note, I think, from your speech, and it was, this sort of a cycle of, you have socio-economic inequality and you have lower outcomes of education. How do you get out of that? It's a lot about, I guess, learning from each other in terms of the member states, but it's still very little where we are at the EU level for sure. And partly it's because of the lack of competence, and partly it's also because of the political priorities, I guess, at the national level, because education is indeed something where reforms sort of take effect much later than in the immediate political cycle. So it's something which is hard to sell to the voters. And I just wanted to let you know that, okay, so I see some, for the people joining online, please do not hesitate to leave questions. I'm not entirely sure that the Q&A section is working, because I'm still seeing there the questions from the previous section. So I would be very thankful for some questions from the online audience, just for me to understand whether that chat box works there. But without further ado, I will give name to Sylvia for a short comment, and then we will start our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Can you hear me well? Yes. Thank you. So I'm very glad for how this conversation, I would say, was developed. Microview, then employment and education connected in relation to the crisis, and then a better focus on education policies and equality. So this has been a quite circular, indeed, conversation, very interesting. And I think shows how much socioeconomic governance is at the heart of the union ability to tackle inequality. And as Vivian showed at the beginning, to tackle, yes, but not only to enhance them, but also there is a strong impact of socioeconomic governance in also being an obstacle for, in certain situations, for member states to reach better equality. At least this was in the past, it was a bit what we were used to after the 2011 euro crisis. So it's interesting to see a bit this development from socioeconomic governance not being also an obstacle, but also a ground of opportunities for member states to build a more resilient and equal society. And what has stemmed out of these presentations, in my view, is quite interesting, because the question is, how do we build more equal society? And what has been quite interesting is that equality and society have been given different attribute and different meaning throughout this conversation. So when we talk about equality in this context, well, we have been talking about democratized democracy. We have been talking about decentralized policymaking. We have been talking about integration, not only within a country, within the citizenship of a country, but also across Europe. We have been hearing opportunities, access to labor market and to economic life, access to knowledge, anti-poverty measures, solidarity, fiscal redistribution, employment. So all these are, let's say, different phases of equality that are impacted upon by socioeconomic governance. Then also the world society, so an equal society. What do we mean by society? And this discussion has shown that, of course, society is citizenship, is European citizenship. We can also intend it, and it was very well demonstrated by the visualized aid of Zolt, how the regional disparities are also to be taken into consideration when we talk about European society. So at the same time, we can also focus on specific aspects of society, so workers, but also children or young or future generations. We can talk about also values when we talk about society. We have been talking about the lack of democratic accountability, rule of law, all these aspects. And finally, the relationship between the different European institutions, the more democratic accountable one, which have a smaller role in the development of socioeconomic governance, and the more intergovernmental dynamics. So this is a quite rich picture, but without further ado, this was just my brief reaction on that. I would like to have a more specific comment or question on the three different speakers. So starting from Vivian, who I don't see, but I hope is still online and with us. Well, the point is about what she mentioned it, democratic legitimacy. So is democratic legitimacy obviously a key of what she was talking about, the relationship between socioeconomic governance and equality? And then she also mentioned a lot of time the fact that there is a sort of perpetual crisis. And my question, which is a bit, let's say, polemic, with intention to be polemic, is, but time of crisis do not legitimize lack of democratic accountability? It's in times of crisis, sometimes authoritative decisions are taken, the executive power get stronger. So is not the narrative of crisis somehow going hand in hand with a lack of democratic legitimacy? How do we interact in this narrative? And more pragmatically, how do we reach a more democratic legitimacy of the socioeconomic governance? Vivian mentioned a multi-stakeholder macro dialogue, decentralization, and I would like to know whether there is a best practice, there is something emergent, perhaps from the Conference on the Future of Europe. Then going to the second presentation from Zsolt, then the point I think was, is socioeconomic governance effective? So this was the goal of the presentation, very well portrayed. And what I was thinking is that, well, in certain countries, probably socioeconomic governance has been quite effective in imposing, inviting, suggesting regressive socioeconomic policies, but apparently not so effective in promoting progressive socioeconomic policies. So is there an incentive we can think of to invite member states to invest more, to be more efficient, like countries like Italy, Latvia, to actually abide by the socioeconomic priorities in that? And doesn't, in your view, the socioeconomic governance has promoted a more geographically integrate, territorially cohesive, let's say, how can I say, like a more European socioeconomic model? Was it effective in that sense to promote a European, and thinking about geographical term, socioeconomic model? Finally, to Suzanne, extremely interesting presentation, and here the impact of effectiveness on socioeconomic governance is in relation to future generation. So what is interesting is that while I analyze socioeconomic governance and country-specific recommendation and all the inputs from the European Commission to the member state, I had the impression that education policy were often perceived in relation to the labor market. So there was a sort of functionality between education policy and labor market accent. And as Zolta shows, this is a very key element for a more equal society. However, Suzanne has been talking about education more broadly as a key to form a more holistic and rich human being. So how do you strike the balance? Is there a difficulties in striking this balance? How does the social European semester, strike that balance in your view? And finally, last question for, I guess, everyone is, should we be a bit afraid of austerity measure coming back? Because indeed, as has been mentioned by basically all of you panelists, there is a new crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, there's energy crisis, inflation is going up, public debt is increasing. So should we consider that? So this was the end of my consideration. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So I also see that I have the first question on the chat, and I will open the floor. But first, I will give each of the presenters a possibility to shortly answer Sylvia's question. So Vivian, the floor is yours to answer first.
So thanks, Sylvia, for great questions, and thanks to the other two panelists for wonderful comments.
Yeah, we cannot hear you.
No? Do you hear me now?
Yes, now it's good.
Okay. Yeah, good. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Sylvia for your great comments, and also to the two other panelists whose comments I think perfectly fit with my own. So just briefly to respond to questions that Sylvia raised. about democratic legitimacy, which is clearly key, both for how one deals with socioeconomic governance and also issues of equality. And I guess the first question was perpetual crisis. How do you legitimize things if everything is in perpetual crisis? And what about lack of democratic accountability? And what's really interesting is what we see, what happened with the Eurozone crisis. You think about the ECB in emergency, it took emergency measures, and those emergency measures were normalized over time with its increasingly expansionary monetary policy, largely because I think everyone saw them as legitimate in terms of legitimacy. It had good outcomes and citizens seemed to approve. And the whole procedures, it became increasingly accountable as the ECB explained why it was doing and what it was doing. And so it sort of normalized, it rolled out these procedures and it ratcheted them up and then normalized them. In contrast, what we see with the austerity and structural reform policies embedded in the European semester, they were increasingly delegitimized over time. And you saw that with the rolling back. By 2012, there was already the reinterpretation of the rules, increasing flexibility. By 2015, you had a Juncker Commission that said, actually, we need to deal with the social problems. And the whole focus on crushing unions and cutting welfare states really vanished. So I think what you see is basically those measures were rolled back over time and then completely suspended with the COVID-19 crisis, suggesting that we know where legitimacy is even in a crisis. And that what one could end up saying is that the Eurozone crisis was a serious crisis of legitimacy, and that the pandemic response actually ended up being much, much more legitimate. It wasn't perfect, but much more legitimate. And I guess our big hope now, fearing an austerity crisis, is that one moves forward doing more, learning the lessons actually from the Eurozone crisis, which I should say the Commission was very good about having learned and was ready with new ideas to come, big ideas. It was incrementally changing things throughout the Eurozone crisis, especially after 2015. But then it was also thinking about what do we do next? COVID-19 hits and it comes out with big new ideas on greening the economy, digitalizing society, and dealing with social inequalities. And also the Eurozone the European semester recommendations themselves increasingly focused on how do we deal with inequalities, et cetera, especially the country-specific recommendations. So I guess the question then becomes, can we ensure, and remember that there still is conditionality in the Eurozone semester, even though it's much more bottom up. And that conditionality is a much more positive conditionality focused on addressing social inequalities, which I think is a good thing. So it's that there are now carrots in terms of money to invest and sticks, invest them in the right places. I guess my one question, and I guess one of the problems is that I think money, and this is a question for the other two panelists, money in the Resilience and Recovery Fund goes basically, if we're talking education, I would assume to building schools, but it's not for paying teachers. So how do we ensure that teachers can be paid? And it may just be that by providing the money for the schools, there is money left over in, that countries can now do better pay for teachers to make this a profession that people want to be in, or do more about training. And, from this, we can also talk about addressing poverty, but we should point out, and this is for Zoltan, I think what those charts and graphs show us is what a terrible effect the Eurozone crisis had on Southern Europe in particular, because cuts in education, cuts in training, all of that. I mean, they were massive during the Eurozone crisis, although I might say that maybe this is also about the structure of the euro, the problems of countries that were facing deficits and debts. If we go back to Italy, they were cutting education during cutting money for education, training, et cetera, research and development, all of the things that would have helped growth. They were doing that even before the Eurozone crisis hit. So maybe this is rethinking, this takes us back to the fiscal rules, rethinking those fiscal rules. And then finally, and very quickly, because I realize I've been talking too long, in response to Sylvia's question about how do we democratize and decentralize the European semester, one of the ways, the European semester is now very much a dialogue between Brussels and national capitals. It seems to me one needs to decentralize this further and bring in as much as possible the regions and urban areas, or the local. I know that in Spain this has been happening, but I don't think it's been happening many other places. And it seems to me that the European semester needs to be decentralized by bringing in local actors, also the social partners at every level. But beyond that, at the EU level itself, one has to ask, how do you decentralize? How do you democratize? And for that, one of the ways certainly is, and needs to be more European Parliament involvement via co-decision on the big decisions, because it's basically left out. But beyond that, what about the big ideas, the targets? For the moment, we've got these deficit and debt rules, and what can you substitute for those, for governing by rules and ruling by numbers? My sense is one way to do it would to have what let's call great macroeconomic dialogues that the ECB can be involved with. Yes, it can maintain its independence. It can listen, but basically to bring in the member states and the council, European members of parliament, but also civil society, to have these and dialogue about where the EU should go from here, even in terms of targets. And in this, one could ask, one might do this via, to bring in citizens. It might be something modeled on the Conference on the Future of Europe, which arguably was not a great success in terms of citizens recognizing that this was going on across Europe. But in terms of the outcomes, in terms of the recommendation, actually it seemed very, very forward-looking. So one is great macroeconomic dialogues, another would be grand industrial strategy dialogues. And this could be part of, what goals for growth? Where do we go from here? And again, this could perhaps be much more a commission thing with the European Parliament. And again, in this case, definitely bring in the social partners, the unions, and business to think about what do we need for growth. At the moment, it's a much more technocratic affair. And it needs to be made much more inclusive. And it could build on the European Parliament's existing economic dialogues and monetary dialogues, but bring in civil society and actors and have more ambitious objectives that focus on sustainable and equitable growth, that think about how you begin to attack issues of inequality and the rest.
Thank you so much. So without further comment, because I also have a million questions in audience for sure as well, I think I will add a couple of questions from the audience now to Sylvia's, and then give the other two speakers the floor. So somebody have a question? Yes. And I will also read the chat questions after that, because we have two. Oh yeah, there's the mic. So here you are.
Okay, great. Thank you. Henry Haapanala, University of Antwerp, a PhD student in social policy. Mainly my question, I think, is for Vivian, but I think the other panelists as well, if you have some input here. I mean, thanks so much for kind of this really, extensive kind of overview of EU socio-economic governance, throughout the two crises we've had in the last decade, or how many we have. But a lot of these kind of EU approaches still, they boil down to soft law. So we have like areas like education where the EU does not have so much authority. We have other areas as well. The European semester, which is again, like critics would also argue, something that is not necessarily in any of the 3Ds. Henceforth, we have this kind of organization that is organized like in kind of this creative aspect as well. A lot of these kind of like EU COVID responses as well. Like, like authors also, or people argue that it is, a very kind of innovative way of creating like institutions and creating solutions like in the constraints of what we have in the treaties. But moving from kind of soft law into hard law, into more practical implementations, into effective ways forward, we've got the European Pillar of Social Rights, we've got the Minimum Wage Directive, we've got a lot of these new legislative proposals in which the EU actually wants to make a lot more concrete influence, concrete aspects, especially in labor markets, and especially in terms of improving collective bargaining, improving social partnership, and then they are really putting it more forward in a hard concrete basis. So your thoughts on kind of this, on the relation between soft law and hard law in terms of moving governance forward?
Thank you so much. So could you pass the mic to the next? We'll take two more and then the online and then give the floor.
Thank you. I'm Isabelle from Climate Action Network Europe. It's also two questions for Vivian. I mean, one is you spoke about a next generation EU becoming a permanent facility. It's a topic that we are starting to discuss also in the climate movement. What will come next? How will we fund the transition? And I was wondering whether you have arguments for countries that are net contributors, because that's really the hard thing to sell. I mean, a number of member states are very happy about the idea, but obviously those who will be net contributors, we need arguments. My second question or reaction, I would say, I mean, I came out of the previous panel, we spoke about agnosticism towards growth or degrowth, and then you end your speech saying that the main argument is that these investments will be good for growth. And I mean, couldn't we rather say, I mean, they may or not generate growth, most probably they will generate growth, but should the criteria not be that they will strengthen our societies? You were speaking about crisis. We have the climate crisis, which is at our door. Is it not about investments that will strengthen our societies? I'm not fond of the word resilience because it looks like we accept something, but I mean, you see what I mean. Thank you. And thank you for the brilliant, fascinating intervention.
Thank you. Yeah, and could you pass the... Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is Michiel Oudijk. I'm active in the Dutch Education Union. And I fully agree with the statement that better education can help can help solving inequalities in society. One of the problems we face in the Netherlands at this moment is that a lot of private schools and private courses are promoting their work, and some parents tend to spend a lot of money to get their children on these special courses. So there is a new schism in society. Some parents cannot afford to send their children to these courses, and the rich parents can afford. I wonder if someone in the panel can comment on this new gap in education.
Thank you so much. So I will also now read the questions online, and then I think we will still have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So I will read the one question, which I think is more for Joat and for Suzanne. And then also I will read the question for Vivian, so then she can answer after that. So, okay, so the question, which is more for Suzanne and Joat, is asked by Monica Duchas. Could we aspire for equality on European society when the economy and economies are confronted with a high level of needs, so namely those neither in employment nor in education or training. And young people have reduced chances to access labor market. Are young people more at risk of exclusion from the labor market and in labor poverty, which I think is extremely important for us to talk about, due to the pandemic education system reforms? How can policies for young people favoring the transformations of the environment and learning tools, given that the youth are prone to digital skills and they can show and use their creativity? Thank you and congratulations for the debate. Okay, so I'd like to read out the end. And the second question from anonymous attendee is to Vivian. Agreeing with your vision for the future of EU economic governance, how can a permanent fund, for example, the Recovery and Resilience Fund, be created or consolidated under the current fiscal rules? Thank you in advance. So without further ado, I will give the Suzanne and Zlot possibility to answer. We'll start with Zlot and then Suzanne, and then give back floor to Vivian for a short answer to all these extremely big questions. So, yeah.
I thought, okay.
Yeah, we can start as you would prefer.
No,
yeah,
please go ahead.
So thank you very much for all the great questions. Now let me start with Sylvia's three very pertinent questions, which certainly made me think. The first one was that regressive policies can be pushed by the EU on member states, but more progressive policies much less. And your question was what to do with that. And I have to admit I don't have any magic solution, but I agree what Vivian also said, that the solution should also include carrots, not only sticks. Again, all kinds of these social policies are all at the competence of the member states. But if they get some benefits for complying with recommendations, that could certainly increase the chances that they will adopt policies which are also more progressive. And it also leads to your second main question, whether we have a more European social model. And on that, let me first start by saying that we know that Europe is very diverse. I mean, the way, let's say, Southern Europeans or the Nordic countries or Western Europeans or Eastern Europeans, what history and cultural background they have is very much different. And also, it also reflected in political and social preferences on how the welfare state is actually built. But there is an important but. Even if social policies are almost entirely national, the EU can do a lot. And for example, the proclamation of the European Pillar of Social Rights, I think was a very welcome development, because even though not everyone agrees that they should do a lot to reduce inequalities, but at least gender inequality, equal opportunities, the inclusion of people with disabilities are included as key principles, including also education, lifelong learning, and all things like that. And countries have to work on that. They have to report on that, what progress they make. So even if there are major cultural differences across the EU and different political preferences, there is a lot of discussion about these issues now. 20, 15 years ago, very limited talk about social issues and inequalities, not just in the EU, but also elsewhere. Some people said, for example, that the IMF is now out picketing Piketty, Thomas Piketty, who will be a speaker tomorrow. 2 decades ago, the IMF didn't even mention the word of inequality. Now they are writing lots of reports. So I think there's a major shift in the policy dialogue, both within Europe and more globally, and also in the European policy dialogue. I think that at least that we are forced to talk much more about social issues and inequalities. Even if there will not be a uniform social model in Europe, I think some convergence is ought to happen and will likely to happen. Now, turning to the questions from the floor, which is, as you said, could be relevant for me or Susan. I'm really worried about indeed the impact of COVID on the youth. I mean, one issue is certainly the digital divide, which Susan very much emphasized, that the access to digital technologies is very much dependent on background, on family background. You know, in poorer families, they don't have proper equipment, they don't have the culture of using that. In richer families, they use every day, and even the children at a young age already obtain a good level of digital literacy. And again, the COVID crisis hit harder those who are lesser educated, less able to do telework. I think it's also very important divide factor that I mean, those occupations which typically require higher qualifications, which can be made from home or from anywhere in the world, so that those people were hit much less than, you know, people, let's say, working in the tourism industry, which is by definition is subject to social contacts. And again, those people can't work from home. I mean, if you work for a hotel, you know, and there are no guests in the hotel, I mean, maybe the accountant can still do the accounting, but 90% of the personnel cannot really work from them. So I first of all very much share the concern of the questioner that the younger generation, especially those which have lower or weaker digital skills and coming from weaker backgrounds, are hit harder. And I mean, what we can do, you know, the solutions are not, I mean, we have some solutions like the Recovery and Resilience Facility. As it was also said, it was more distributed to Southern Europe than, let's say, to Western Europe. So if countries can make good use of that money, I think that can be a good boost. And also, as a final remark, let me return to my closing comment in my presentation, in which I show the chart that unfortunately Southern European countries are not just more in that they have higher inequality and higher poverty, but also much less efficient domestic social redistribution systems. So if they can get better advice on how to make, you know, social redistribution better, then using the same amount of money, they can do much more for avoiding a new youth divide. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So please give good advice.
We try our best. No, but it's difficult now to answer because there are so many things in this debate, and I try to structure and keep it short. There was the question on labor market and from Sylvia in the beginning. So if there is a kind of conflict between education to help young people to get into the labor market and get jobs versus a more broader understanding of education, and I think this debate is coming kind of to an end. That is my feeling, because with the transitions and with the economic developments we have, it is difficult to divide on what type of skills and competences a young person needs only for work and what it needs for the rest of the life. So this is kind of becomes more and more artificial. Probably it was already artificial 100 years ago, but it is I think more obvious if we want to have creative, motivated people trying to develop societies, trying to develop economies. It is not enough to have a very reduced education picture and as such. Besides that, we know more and more we are looking at how can you improve basic skills, and one of the solutions is that people have to, or children have to be in the position that they are able to learn, that they are motivated to learn, that they are curious. Otherwise they will also not learn reading, writing and calculating. So this means that if you just put them down to learn reading, writing and calculating and nothing else, you will never achieve basic skills. So I think this conflict is in a kind of disappearing, I think, and this is also more and more understood, I hope. So but coming from the labor market, of course, to the young people, I share also this concern that the fact that they were more hit in the crisis, and especially those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, will also be visible and might have longer term effects. So it was always this type of these carrying effects on young people when they start so difficult into a career, into start of a active economic life. This shows for a longer time. There are some measures in place, and I think there's also quite some awareness about this issue. So within the RRF, there's also in many countries there are exactly measures for needs for the so-called the youth guarantee we had a couple of years ago, which is prolonged, and we'll also look at this, and also the idea to have this year as the European Year of Youth, which leads to lots of discussions, and it is of course first a campaign, but nevertheless I think it also shows the awareness that young people are really at the core of, or should be at the core of our concerns in that way. Some other points which were raised as questions. So soft law, hard law, that I find a nice question, because of course it is soft law education. I do not know if I even want to be at hard law. I don't want Brussels to sit down and write the curriculum of 27 member states. No way. Education systems are very traditional in member states. There are lots of links to the overall understanding of education to culture. I think, no, we should not centralize that. And all studies show the more decentralized an education system is, the better it functions and can react to situations. So nevertheless, soft law becomes very hard if you link, for example, like in the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the agreement on the recovery and resilience plans to addressing country-specific recommendations of previous years. And then there's a little bit also then a possibility where more influence is possible, and where also a little bit of pressure can be exerted on policies. So I think this is but what I wanted to mention also with the view of austerity and is the whole question on, and Jolt mentioned it also for social policies, the effectiveness of spending, and to really look at policy evaluation, to really look at where is our money best spent if we have less and less of it. And this is a debate which has started among member states in education systems, stronger from 2019, where we had the first meeting of education ministers with finance ministers to exactly look at smart investment in education. And it's something we want to look at more, because in the end of the day, we know relatively little in education what works and what it is worth spending on. So I think there is something we really need to do more to be more clever. And I think we always have to expect that we will not float in money, and we might have to struggle with austerity. Have I something I wanted to say in addition? No, I think I stop here, because it is a broad debate. The private schools, there are very different situations across member states on the level of private schools. And indeed, there is a risk also on another type of divide. I think the point for me is, and that is a very broad answer, and I know it's not probably satisfying, and I'm happy to discuss it more in detail. But the thing is, how attractive are public schools in comparison to private? And I think also we have this discussion very much for schools in disadvantaged areas, where there are some very nice projects across Europe, where member states invested in making disadvantaged area schools so attractive that it became attractive for families from better off backgrounds. So, and I think there we have to look at a good high quality public education system, and not stare too much on the private. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. So before I give the floor to Vivian for the final answer, I just wanted to say that one thing, that actually in Latvia, the schools funded by the EU money became famous about being empty after 2008 crisis, because there was newly renovated school by EU money, and then there was no one left to be. And then, I mean, I hope that with remote work or something, it sort of can change again. So this last link you made, I think, is excellent, in the sense that we need to make regions also attractive. And unfortunately, school is part of that. If there is no school, then the place dies out, as my city sociologist mother would say. So, okay, so I will read out the last question from the chat and really give the opportunity to Vivian to conclude, because we are all over the time. So there is a question from Maria Petmesido. It is one thing the IMF's adoption of a rhetoric acknowledging inequalities, and another the cynical reality of the IMF's policies imposed upon the bailout countries during the Great Recession, see Greece, for instance, the aftershocks of which are still being felt, only to be compounded by the COVID and current geopolitical crisis. So on this very dire comment, I will give the floor to Vivian to answer the questions, and then we will finally have the short break. Thank you.
So yeah, thanks for that last question. I should just add, let's not just blame the IMF. Let's blame the ECB and the Commission and the ministers of finance in the Eurogroup. They were all responsible for what happened to Southern Europe during that time. But hopefully that's behind us, and we now need to look to what the future would be. So in response to the anonymous question on the chat, how can a permanent fund be consolidated under the current fiscal rules? Well, I think there could be a permanent fund that can be consolidated, but these current fiscal rules don't work anyway. The numbers are completely wrong. And of course, they reflect an ideology that I hope is passé, a kind of neoliberal and ordoliberal focus on stability, on debt and deficit at a low level, clear that destroyed the possibility for investment for all, let alone what you got in terms of the Eurozone crisis issues. What we need to move is new ideas, moving away from neoliberalism to some new form of progressivism, or should we call it sustainability? Because I do get it in terms of Isabel's comment. Let's talk about investments for sustainability rather than growth. The language has been sustainable growth in the EU documents, which is why I used it, but I'm perfectly happy to change that. But importantly, and this is the other aspect of the question, what is I think the important real question is what happens with the net contributors? Do they really want to spend all this money? Well, for one, they're not, because we're talking about EU level debt paid for by EU level own resources. And this is based on the strength of the euro itself and the possibility of that, and the ECB to back up all of that. But leave that aside, there's another answer to this. Which is that if you create a new kind of EU level solidarity fund beyond Next Generation EU, and think about it as dealing with a whole range of problems that the EU is facing, a whole range of crises. If we're just talking about the Ukraine crisis, there needs to be more military spending, more common solutions on securing energy supplies, more solidarity on dealing with the refugees from the Ukraine, more spending on security at the EU level, not just in the member states, money for rebuilding Ukraine, and I'm only talking about the Ukraine crisis. On top of that, we need money, and let's talk about different adjustment funds, arguably within one common EU sovereign debt fund, let's call it that, or it can be many different funds. But what you need is, and this is why I think member states would buy it, is that different member states would benefit from different funds. So it wouldn't be, I'm giving all my money to them, but rather, I'm getting this, they're getting that. And there's, so think about a whole range of funds, a refugee integration fund. Germany would get a lot of that, Sweden as well. A migrant adjustment fund, again, Germany. And the refugee integration fund, well, for third world, for third country nationals, that would not be Central and Eastern European countries, including Hungary in particular, or Poland, but they would be arguably getting it for the Ukraine refugees. An energy and climate adjustment fund, to alleviate Poland's worries, and Poland has been dragging its feet because it's so dependent on coal, provide money to ensure, to help there. So Energy and Climate Adjustment Fund, an Unemployment Solidarity Fund, in particular, let's say in Southern Europe. And it could be used in a variety of ways, say for training or whatever. A poverty alleviation fund, a brain drain fund. You know, one of the problems is Central and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe have been paying a lot of money, spending a lot of money on the educating doctors, for example, and technicians, economists, many of whom I see in Brussels. Why not have some sort of a brain drain fund to ensure that countries are paid back so that everyone benefits, that the net contributors will also gain from the funds, while those that don't participate don't necessarily get those funds, but still benefit from others. So Poland, as I said, could gain support on climate transition, but of course, only if it conforms to rule of law. Hungary as well. Okay, so that's essentially my answer on why I think it's necessary, useful, and might, if it's a multi-fund as opposed to just one specific purpose, might actually work better. But finally, on the first question about can we move from soft law to hard law, Zolt was absolutely right, I think. You know, these are areas where you can't impose. And as Zolt said, that one needs to do better with the money that you have, but perhaps more funding can be available, just as the Resilience and Recovery Fund is doing that, is providing carrots. But sticks can't be hard law. You know, I'm sorry. It's just because remember that we're talking about very different varieties of capitalism, different growth models, or let's call them sustainability models. And so it's each country has to knows what it needs to do. Within this context, I think the Commission can only accompany, can only propose and recommend, and also provide administrative help. I think there's, what is it? DG reform? No, what is it? Yeah, it is DG
it's
reform.
correct. Yeah.
Yeah. That actually is doing a lot for member states in terms of administrative help. But of course, more needs to be done. And the part of the problem on the spending is that there are problems of social justice and equity within current pension systems, which is why we see so much spending in Southern Europe that is not nearly as efficient, et cetera. So no hard law here, a lot more soft law and encouragement. And I think Suzanne was right that a lot of the, it's very helpful that there's so much sharing, that in the various councils of ministers, what you get is sort of recognition or getting a sense of best practices and ways to help solve problems. But ultimately, you know, democracy, when we're talking about the politics, is at the national level. I think the best the EU can do is try to encourage that and provide more funds. So instead of having been the sort of the austerian and the voice of austerity all these years, maybe it can become the voice of sustainability and of social equity. And I think it's already becoming that and has become that. But then maybe it can put money behind that as well, which will provide further support for the member states. And maybe this is another way to address the dangers of populism and the popular revolt, really, against austerity that we've seen in most member states to a lesser or greater degree.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think it's excellent. So we have to conclude, and a place where we have we have to have a lot of reform is actually a better place to be than a place where we don't have any ideas how to move forward. So I think this has been excellent. Thank you so much for the panel, but we still have so much, so we have to go home now and write down what we have to actually do, which I think is useful. So thank you so much for all the panelists and the audience. And if you have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to come and ask the panelists, because I'm sorry I couldn't take more. Thank you, and a round of applause to all of us. Thank you, Vivian.